All right, well, welcome. I'm Christina Hochul. I head our Strategic Alliance Development function at Alexion, so AstraZeneca's Rare Disease Business Unit. And so we're going to start by having some introductions. So if everyone can tell me their name, their organization, and how did they get into health policy. So Tiffany, we'll start with you.
Sure. So my name is Tiffany Westrich-Robertson. I am the CEO and original founder of AI Arthritis, which is short for International Foundation Autoinflammatory Arthritis. I'm also here as a patient. I live with non-radiographic axial spondyloarthritis. And also our organization is leading an agnostic national coalition called the Ensuring Access Through Collaborative Health, or EACH, and a collaborating novel patient and caregiver coalition called the Patient Inclusion Council, which is addressing the government drug affordability reviews.
Wonderful.
I didn't answer how I got into
how did you get in health policy?
So my background is actually, I was an educator, and then also as CEO, it's important that I kind of have my hands in everything, but as a mission of our organization, it's all based on listening to each other. So not only myself, but other staff are living with our diseases. So our motto is we don't represent the patient voice, we are the patient voice. And it's our responsibility to listen to one another and identify the most pressing issues. That's what we tackle. So we truly are a problem-solving organization based on, we say, patient-identified issues and patient-infused, pun intended, solutions. And that's how we got into public policy, because that's an issue, right? And so that's what led me here.
Thank you, Tiffany. Stephen?
Hi, Stephen Newmark. I represent the Global Healthy Living Foundation, and like Tiffany, I too am a patient. I have axial spondyloarthritis and Crohn's disease. The Global Healthy Living Foundation, we help patients in 4 ways. Number one, we support patients. We created a community where patients can come together and know that they're not alone. We're mostly online, digital platform. We communicate with our patients over all of your social media platforms that you're familiar with, YouTube. We host webinars. During the pandemic, we were very proud, we conducted Zoom kitchen events where some of our patients would cook meals together over Zoom and things like that. So the sense of community. Number two, community and support. Number two is education. We educate our patients. We provide easy to understand content, we call it. Content comes in the form of either audio. We do a lot of podcasts. We put together newsletters, things of that nature, to help patients understand their disease and their disease journey. Sometimes it's as simple as how to talk to your employer about your condition, how to talk to your doctor, how to prepare for a doctor's visit, things of that nature. Number three, we do patient-centered research, and that's a whole arm of folks with a lot of acronyms after their name that I don't have, and they conduct a lot of patient-centered research to help improve patient outcomes and inform medical decisions later down the road. And then finally, we do policy and advocacy, and that's where I come in. We help to advocate on behalf of policies that help patients achieve the best outcomes. And how did I get into health policy? Well, I guess it's a long journey. I'm an attorney by background. I spent 10 years purely practicing law at a big law firm here in New York. Then I've always had an interest in public policy. I have a degree in public policy. I spent almost 8 years in New York City government. I was the chief health policy advisor to the mayor of New York City. And I spent 2 years at the New York City public hospital system, which is the largest public hospital system in the country. And then I've been in my current job for 5 years as the I don't even know my role. Head of policy at the Global Healthy Living Foundation.
Thank you.
I wonder about my role constantly too. So, hi everyone, I'm Daniel Vigil, head of state policy at Novartis. Really that means helping lead the analysis of the potential impact of many of the public policies that we'll be talking about this afternoon. How I got into policy, just a passion for how public policies impact our daily lives, and there's no more impactful space, right, than healthcare policy. So I started off working with healthcare providers, then worked with the health insurance industry for a while, and now in the pharmaceutical and biopharmaceutical space. So happy to be here. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, since the title of the panel is Threats to Innovation, we'll start out with innovation. So the pharmaceutical industry has devoted like $83 billion of research and development just in 2019, and that's based on government data. And this amount is 10 times what was spent each year in the 1980s, adjusting for inflation. So with this rise in innovation and a lot of great therapies out there, we have a lot more specialty drugs. They treat really complex diseases, chronic diseases, rare diseases, as we've heard about. And it really requires, and as we know, this drug development process is very long, and it's lengthy, and it takes a very long time, and only about 12% of drugs that enter clinical trials actually go on to get approved by the FDA. And based on government data, you spend about $1 billion to $2 billion per drug to finally reach that FDA status. So we'll start talking about innovation. I'd like to start with Daniel. So what does innovation mean to the biotech industry?
Well, it's really meant an evolution or maybe even a revolution, and I think many of the folks in the room today are at the forefront of that. And when I think about that evolution or even revolution, I really think about personalized medicine, right? Precision medicine.
Right.
And the promise that's being delivered now today with regards to treatments that are tailored to individuals' genes, maybe even their lifestyles or their environments, and the promise that's being delivered with regards to improved healthcare outcomes, and even the potential for improved some healthcare costs, right? Healthcare cost growth. So that is the ultimate sort of promise of innovation, and precision medicine, I think, is at the forefront of that.
Very true. And then I'd love to ask both Stephen and Tiffany, what does innovation mean for the patient perspective?
Yeah,
Stephen, if you'd like to start.
Absolutely. From a patient perspective, so my organization, we represent chronically ill patients, but the vast majority of our patients have autoimmune conditions like Tiffany and I have. And we rely on these biologic medications. Biologic medications very often, and I'm not a doctor, so I refer you to our previous panelists and if you want to discuss it more on a medical level, but on the patient level, I hear from my doctors all the time, you don't know if a drug is going to work, and that's true for a lot of drugs, but particularly in this space, you could try a drug for up to 3 months before realizing whether it works or is not working. That means you're going to have to potentially try a variety of different medications before you find the right medication for you, number one. Number two, they're inevitably, and I say inevitably because I hear this from my gastroenterologist and my rheumatologist, inevitably you will come to a point where you're going to have to move on to another drug. The drug will cease to have its efficacy for your condition. So you're going to have to move on. So you're essentially relying on innovation in the industry. And I ask my doctors all the time. I'm like, how much longer? Do I have to move on? Do I have to move on? Like, don't worry. Don't worry, the pharmaceutical industry is coming out with new innovations all the time. It's great to be a patient. It's the best time ever in the history of the world to be a patient. You're going to be okay. There's going to be new innovations coming down the road. So I hope and that these threats that we're going to be discussing are not actually real, and that because I personally rely on the innovation to come in the next decade and decades to come.
And then Tiffany?
And without repeating.
Sorry.
Because that was really good.
Sorry.
Good job. So the first word that comes to my mind is hope. So when I think, and when I say I really am speaking on behalf of thousands and thousands of millions of patients at Arthritis. I am in the trenches. I am in those social media groups. These are my friends. And we really thrive in peer-to-peer conversations every day, in and out. So when I say I really do mean we, as I do feel confident that I can speak on behalf of patients living with these diseases. And the autoimmune and autoinflammatory arthritis diseases, I should mention, is only about 20-something. So autoimmune is 100 plus. Then you add the autoinflammatory, which is still comprised in the immune system, just a different side. So we're talking well over 100. And so our organization narrows it down to the ones that are most alike. So when we're talking, whether it's lupus, psoriatic arthritis, spondyloarthritis, juvenile versions, we really do have similar stories in saying that the threat is hope. And when in innovation in particular, kind of piggybacking on what you said about how long it takes, to get to even to market. And we go through these clinical trials. Well, what happens, because our diseases are heterogeneous, we are very different. So when these drugs get to market, only about 40 to 60% of us are even going to respond. And of course, there's other things, as we noted earlier, that clinical trial diversity, et cetera, plays a part in that as well. But that's also why I can say XYZ is my miracle drug, and I can talk to somebody with the same diagnosis, the same profile even, and say, that did nothing for me. And I think we have to keep that in mind, because if we're doing a trial and error process, first of all, I missed my window of opportunity to probably ever achieve remission. And that's important to note, because if we're really talking about cost for the healthcare system, then you should want me to have remission, right? And so that's why I and arthritis and most patients you'll hear are proponents of precision medicine, because there is no such thing as an average patient, and innovation gives us hope that one day we won't have to do the trial and error process, and then we actually don't have to be on these expensive drugs for the next 50 years of our lives.
Can I just add something?
Go ahead, Sam.
Because Christina, those numbers, I'd never heard those numbers before about the, in terms of the research and development and how much more is being invested versus the 1980s. What's fascinating to me is my organization, we're 25 years old, so we started in the late 90s. And I know from our founders, we used to host events, similar in size to this, and the first few rows used to be roped off, and that was for the folks coming in who had wheelchairs, who were coming in with walkers, things of that nature. 2024, fast forward, we host events, and we don't have that anymore.
Wow.
And that's because of these innovations. So our patients, for one, are very grateful for the innovations and look forward to even more innovation.
Well, that's wonderful, and thank you for sharing that. Just even seeing the progress from the patient perspective, I think, is really important. So now we're going to move on to some of the challenges or like the threats to innovation. And so I think everyone's aware that President Biden signed into law the Inflation Reduction Act, or the IRA. It was a very landmark piece of legislation as part of his administration. There were several different components to the law. On positive side, there is a lot of affordability provisions for patients. So patients' drug costs out-of-pocket cap, as they call it, is $2,000. They can smooth that over the year, starting next year. There's also an insulin cap on the copay you would pay for your insulin product per month. So a lot of great affordability provisions in there. But there are also challenges with the Inflation Reduction Act, and specifically from the rare disease perspective, we're worried about the orphan drug exclusion from negotiations. So the provision is very narrowly tailored to one indication, one designation, and we're working on a legislative solution to expand that. But I'd like to hear from our panelists here about how they're thinking of the Inflation Reduction Act, and how they are also working with the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, as they go about implementing this new law. So maybe I'll start with Tiffany, and you can kind of speak to how you guys have been working with CMS on it and some of the listening sessions.
Sure. So I'm going to go back to 2023 towards the end, where I call it the new era of patient engagement, because things really changed. And we're going to talk about prescription drug affordability boards, or PDABs, as well. So this kind of ties in as a parallel. So prior to that time, patient organizations largely, who do have a lot of staff that may not be living with the diseases, and that's are representing the patient voice and do well at that. So have a great place at the table. And what started happening was we were hearing, we want the real patient. And I'm like, you're a real patient, I'm a real patient. But what they meant was they want people who aren't affiliated with patient organizations. They want patients who maybe have never been in public policy. Yeah. I get that. And thankfully, arthritis recognized that back in 2015, and we've been putting programs in place where we're recruiting our peers and friends, and really coming from a non-judgmental place of education and letting patients make their own decisions and inform their own perspective. So we're definitely not one-sided in that. In saying that, we were asked to find real patients to participate, and they're ironically asking the patient organizations who they don't necessarily want them affiliated with. Anyway, we started reaching out and putting, like myself, I went on Facebook or went on social media, and I just said, are you on this drug? And if so, would you like to tell your story? And I had a lot that said, well, I didn't do well on that drug, so you probably don't want my story. I said, nope, totally wrong, because that would be biasing. And we want to make sure that CMS sees us as an ally, right? We're not trying to stack the deck with people who have these amazing stories about the two drugs that were on ours. So we did successfully recruit 40% of the participants that were on our two drugs on both, and 40% of those had never spoken publicly before. So we did achieve that. In saying that, several of them did not do well on the drug, but we did explain to them why that mattered, and the answer was innovation.
Yeah.
So they did say, this drug didn't work for me, but guess what? Neither did 9 others. Or some of them said, well, I just haven't found the right one, or I did find the right one. It wasn't this one, but don't take it away from the people who it is their miracle. So that's how we really participated. And since then, we have written letters. CMS, the staff is very great and gracious and listening to, they understand there's a trial and error, and they're very open and willing to listen for next time. And we also were part of the National Health Council's roundtable in DC about a month ago, I guess, where a bunch of organizations came together with CMS.
Right.
And we kind of told them all collectively what we all identified as improvements, and so we're still engaged with that, including with the coalitions that AR Arthritis is running.
Oh, that's great. And then Stephen, I don't know if you have anything to add from your perspective.
Well, I guess from our perspective, the IRA is troubling just almost from an academic standpoint, because when you read about it in a generic newspaper article or a press release that an elected official puts out, it sounds so pro-patient. And actually, the provisions you mentioned are pro-patient, and we very much are supportive. The $35 insulin cap, particularly the Part D, the smoothing. But they're also, but a big part of the IRA, a big part of the cost containment of the IRA is to essentially force drug manufacturers to negotiate down prices with Medicare. And the issue for that is it does stifle innovation, which we can talk about in greater depth. But to me, and to our organization, the troubling aspect of that is that's not ignoring necessarily to the benefit of a patient. That's ignoring to the benefit of Medicare, and it's great. I'm a taxpayer. I want our government to save money wherever they can, but I certainly don't want to do it on the backs of chronically ill patients and patients who need access to medications. And if you're going to limit access to medications, at least be intellectually honest about what you're doing. And my real suspicion is that most of these particularly the elected officials who put out these press releases and make these pronouncements don't actually know what it is that they're doing and its effects on patients. But ultimately, what's frustrating for us is we have patients who need access to medications, and it's being threatened because of these provisions of the IRA, which were essentially, if I may even go further, which were essentially added in large part to reduce the overall cost package of the IRA, so it could fall under. I'm going to fumble it, but essentially to control costs of the bill itself.
And Daniel, I don't think you have anything. I don't know if you have anything to add from like the business perspectives, how different business units are thinking about that, or disease areas.
Yeah, so in policymaking, obviously we have to navigate unintended consequences.
Right.
And Stephen, to your point of maybe our policymakers don't always have a full view of what those unintended consequences can be when voting for a piece of legislation. There's a great example within the IRA. Everyone in this room knows that often investment into a drug doesn't stop once the drug is approved by the FDA and it's been commercially launched, right? Research and development continues, and that can lead to new indications for a drug, treating different diseases. With the IRA, price controls can come into effect differently depending on what kind of drug CMS is looking at, right? So for a small molecule drug or like a pill product, right, that's 9 years after FDA approval, the IRA's price controls can go into effect. For large molecule drugs or biologics, that's 13 years. So when you look at where investment dollars are going to go, there's going to be a potential, at least, right, for a real-world unintended consequence where resources are going to maybe be put in that 13-year window versus the 9-year window, where you could sort of maximize the impact for patients before these price controls go into effect. So, and this is real, and we have data that shows. So, for example, in the oncology space, in the last decade, 60% of drugs that were approved were later approved after launch for additional indications that treat different types of cancer. So if the price controls under the IRA or maybe other different laws were in effect at that time, and those investment dollars, those research investment was not made out of fear of maybe the price controls going into effect, those are additional treatment options that may have not made their way to patients. So that was not as much of the debate, I think, with many of our policymakers as probably it should have been during the time. Also flagging the cardiovascular space, very similar story. CV trials often are more resource intensive than maybe some other spaces. They take longer, they take larger populations. And if you're researching additional indications or different ways of this already launched drugs can treat new populations, there may be a question, right, of do we put these resources in when perhaps that 9-year window for small molecule drugs may question, like, why not put those resources into sort of the longer runway at 13 years? So those are the unintended consequences for innovation. At the end of the day, it's patients who will be impacted directly if those unintended consequences come to fruition. So.
No, definitely. We also like to think the orphan drug exclusion provision in negotiation was also unintended consequences.
Sure.
That, to your point, they didn't realize that a lot of rare disease products get multiple indications.
Absolutely.
As you study it more in different diseases, you'll get a follow-on, you'll get another indication of the product, and that is common in the rare disease space to some extent. But I don't know if Tiffany and Steve, if you want to add anything about how people can be engaged in the process or things moving forward as we watch kind of the IRA unfold.
Well, we're at the stage, the law's the law. Like Tiffany, our organization is engaged as much as we can with CMS. I think the big thing is, it's just the idea of the importance of having, to use Tiffany's term, real patients, whatever that means, to actually have patients meet with policymakers, preferably in advance of legislation being put forth, but also even post-legislation, to hear from actual patients the importance of these things. Look, at the end of the day, healthcare is expensive, right? That's just how it goes. Healthcare is expensive. 150 years ago, we didn't have the kind of healthcare we have right now. Right now, we have these gigantic hospitals. We have the training that you get for doctors, for nurses, for social workers, for technicians, radiologists. The folks who are working in a hospital is like, it wasn't like this 150 years ago. The amount of availability of therapies for people is something that wasn't around 150 years ago, and those things cost money. We're talking about an industry that's not like a television set. Like I'm looking at that screen over there. A television set, I can go into Costco and probably buy one for like $100 nowadays. It's essentially the cost of production plus a little bit more. With R&D into the pharmaceutical industry, I don't know the stat that you just said. I'm sorry, I didn't memorize it, but the amount of investment that you have to make and the amount of drugs that fail, that don't get to where they need to get to, is something that I don't think the general public has an appreciation for, which is why it's so important for Tiffany's group, for my group, for so many other patients to inform policymakers of the need for this.
No, thank you. And I think on that note, we'll move over to the PDAB part of the conversation.
Which is why I had him go first, because my answer was going to balance between the two.
So, Tiffany, do you want to start by telling us what a PDAB is for anyone who may not know what they are?
So these prescription drug affordability boards, or PDABs, are established in various states. And they're established by the governor. There is a bill that needs to be introduced and then go into law. So this is a policy issue. And with that, there are boards that range from 5 to 8 or 9 of these people who are appointed by the governor, and they have backgrounds in health, so it could be health economics or health system in some way. I do want to point out, though, that there is not a real process put into place. There is guidance that is put in these bills. The amount that patients or patient organizations, et cetera, can be involved is minimal. It's up for interpretation. No state is the same, meaning no process that is put forth is the same. And so depending on, nobody on these boards either necessarily live with the diseases or have information or knowledge about the drugs that are treating them. So they're in a constant state of sort of absorbing information and figuring things out as we go. And if you all want to add on to what a PDAB is from there.
I just echo that it's really, you've seen one PDAB, you've seen one PDAB. They just vary from state to, how they define their mission varies from state to state. They're essentially tasked with reviewing whether a drug is affordable, but each state has either defined affordable differently or to date has not defined it at all. And then what they do with, or what action they can take when they find a drug unaffordable or affordable just varies from state to state. But 4 of the 8 PDABs that have been created have authority to set what they call upper payment limits. But again, there's just a lot of lack of clarity of what that actually means to patients. How will that be implemented? So when that process starts, again, we're going to say, if you've seen one UPL, you've probably seen one UPL. The other 3 states that have that authority, we're probably going to do it a little differently. So there's a lot of unanswered questions yet so far, and that's not stopping them. They're still moving forward and having they're learning as they go along, and all stakeholders, patients, manufacturers, et cetera, are learning as well.
And then I don't know if, Tiffany, you want to talk a little bit about an example of the engagement around maybe the Colorado PDAB. I know we're in New York, but.
Yeah, and actually I thought of something this morning that, can I preface?
Sure.
Before, because it wasn't planned.
Of course.
Okay. So I think and I know that there are patients that are watching this as well. So I want to make sure that I put this in terminology that makes sense for all of you out there that are watching this. So I thought of this morning. Think of our healthcare system as a Plinko board. So these are those boards that they have all these different pegs, and you put a disc in the top and it goes boop, and then the patients are at the bottom under the Plinko board in their one little cubby hole, right? And they're like, please, Plinko, come down and make sure I get my drug. And so what happens in the current system is there's a price, then it goes to the top of each Plinko category, right? And so you've got your health insurance company, Medicare, right? So they're in one state. So let's just say in one state, all of us, there's a whole group of us under the bottom going, come on, insurance company, come on, pick my drug, right? And so there's all this complication that goes behind closed doors because it goes to the pharmacy benefit managers, and essentially they decide what's going to be on our formulary that year. So me, as a patient who's sitting here on drug A, and I'm doing well, it's my miracle drug, every year I have to sit there and wonder, is it going to be pulled for me because they negotiated a different price and now something else is cheaper? And so then I get non-medically switched, and then, or prior authorization. So is it medically necessary? So some insurance company telling me if I'm medically necessary to stay on my drug. So these kind of things happen. And I think it's important to know that because when you start talking about the PDABs, you start talking about what happens when, let's say, they have these drugs. So they go, and there's different processes in the state of how many drugs they pick. So you have these lists, and Colorado was 5. Colorado was the first one, and that was in that new engagement, that new patient engagement time. And so we had 5. But then you look in Oregon, and it went up to, I don't have it off the top of my head, 612 or something. And so they all have different drugs. Ours, in ours particular one, have ended up on all of them. Biologics are expensive drugs, and they're looking for what the state, in this piece of pie, what is the most expensive part of that pie? And I get that. We all get that, right? We have to start somewhere. But in saying that, if they go and they do a review and they start determining, okay, this drug we find it be unaffordable, and we'll go into how that happens here in a bit. But they come up with this price. The manufacturer list price is still the same. It's just capped at what the state is going to pay for it, the reimbursements that are going through the pharmacy and to the doctors. So it's still trickling through before we get to the Plinko board. Okay, so then it sounds like a really good idea. Capped price, not for patients, that's a misnomer, because all the advertisements say out of pocket for patients. That's not true. So it gets capped up here, and then they think that all this is going to go away, and we're going to end up magically with all of this lower prices, and no patient's going to lose access. But that's not true, because let's just say hypothetically, okay, that drug is priced the lowest, and the doctor can still prescribe it, and it all goes through as planned. Let's just say, all right, great. All of those people on drug A that are standing here at the bottom of the Plinko board that wanted that drug, score. The rest of us get non-medically switched to it. So the rest of us lose. And nobody's thinking about that. And I think that I just really wanted to put that forth, especially knowing that patients are our audience. You can really understand that what's happening is happening above the Plinko board. The Plinko board still exists, and it's still going to happen afterwards. It's not if we remove that, maybe, but we're not removing that, right? So we just have to remember what these unintended consequences are and the reality of negotiations and between the pharmacy benefit managers are going to happen. And then just as far as Colorado and engaging, they were the first state. So there's other states that are following, right? So Oregon was the second to pick their drug list. We've got Maryland now putting theirs on. And so all of them are in different phases.
Yes.
Right? So you've got the ones that are just talking about it. So that's like pre-PDAB. And then you've got the ones that introduce the bills. So it's like, okay, maybe PDAB. And that's where we need to come in and start educating legislators and things like that. The thing that I just want to point out before I turn it over to others to weigh in is this is where the patient engagement comes in, and we forget about research. So my background is actually, I specialize in research advocacy, which I didn't mention earlier. So I'm a focus group moderator. I've taken tons of college courses in different types of research. I can code research, I can analyze research, and I'll talk more about how that all ties into Colorado a little bit later. But I say that because the process is going backwards, meaning if you're going to come up with a solution for research, if a drug is unaffordable or not, you have to have qualifying questions, and you have to know who really is unaffordable before you even, or who can't afford the drug before you even go through it. They're not doing that. They're literally looking at the piece of the pie and they're saying, this is tough for us, before asking patients if we can afford it. And so then it goes through all this lingering process. Patients come to the table, we're asked to share our stories, and if we don't get enough patients that say manufacturer assistance programs are helping us, then it skews the results, and they don't actually know what's affordable and what's not for the patient. So if we don't have the patients participating in the beginning and all of us talking and collecting data to then present to the legislators, to present to the PDABs and say, hold on, we need to talk about research in addition to policy, then we're missing an important point, and that's where we really have been getting involved.
Just on the engagement real quick, I think I just piggyback off of that. I think we have real examples of how PDABs have sort of lost their way already with regards to valuing the feedback from healthcare stakeholders, most importantly patients. So in Colorado, the first drug that went under review was one that treats and is very valuable to the CF community, cystic fibrosis community. So the community turned out in force in Colorado. They did what policymakers generally value, right? They engaged, they logged on, they spoke to their personal experiences with incredibly moving stories. And you would think that the PDAB would welcome that for the next drugs that went under review. But instead, they capped the number of speakers. Apparently, they thought there were too many. So now there's a limit of 10 speakers with the Colorado PDAB for drugs going through the process, right? So that's just an example of a space where the patient voice should be the loudest. They're being capped in the number of voices that they'll listen to.
I'll just give you my personal experience with Colorado. I've been, so Colorado and Oregon, but Colorado specifically, Yes, you're right. They cap it, but I also found it maddeningly, whatever the word is, difficult to participate because they didn't it was a 4-hour meeting. These are roughly 4 hours. They don't tell you exactly when you're going to go, and it's over Zoom. And I remember I was communicating with some of our patients in Colorado, and I'm like, oh my God, like when are we going to go? I had to go to the bathroom. I'm like, what do I do? Like, can I get a glass of water? Like when they call on you, you got to be ready to go. So that's the first thing. It's not like that simple of a process, number one. Number two, this is what drove me absolutely ballistic. The first time I went to a PDAB meeting, I got there, I had my written notes about innovation and all this stuff. But I started listening to these folks, and there was one board member who, first of all, the question was, is XYZ drug unaffordable? So I'm thinking, I'm a lawyer, I used to be a litigator. I'm like, it's like a quasi-leading question to begin with, number one. Number two, I'm like, then they went to this whole thing. I'll never forget, one board member started talking about like, well, what if you're a single parent? Like these prices, if you're a single parent and these are the prices you may have to pay, and the cost of rent is really going up and food is really expensive these days, and da-da-da. And I'm like, what the heck does that have to do with anything? You got to analyze the cost. It has nothing to do with somebody who's a single parent who may be paying more in rent. Like, what are you talking about? Like, stick to the issue. Like, why are you digressing onto these other things? And I just, I kind of unloaded when it was my turn to speak. I said, you're really going off. It's really unfair what you're doing. Talk to actual patients who are able to obtain these patient assistance programs, able to obtain these drugs. And by the way, you know what is unaffordable for somebody that's a single parent? Is to be stable because of their medication and then be taken off that medication and then become an unstable patient. Going back to being sick, if you're an hourly employee and you're not able to go to work, that is very unaffordable. If you are not an hourly employee, however, and you're lucky enough that you are a salaried employee, but you're starting to miss work, that's going to affect your career. That's unaffordable. That's the real unaffordability, but they don't talk about that because it gets a little too complicated. You're 3 or 4 steps removed, and I just found that they just really were not interested in the patient voice whatsoever. Sorry for my tap.
No, that was great. And I don't know if Stephen and Tiffany and even Daniel, if you have any advice of people in this room how to engage in the conversation around PDABs, or what can people be doing?
I mean, I obviously, number one is to show up and explain the story. Like I said, it's so, healthcare is expensive, and the easiest punching bag in healthcare is the pharmaceutical industry, even though they are not the largest contributor to healthcare costs in this country. In fact, I would potentially argue they actually reduce costs in the sense that somebody who is stable on a medication is not receiving surgery, which is where the money really gets spent in healthcare and things of that nature. But I understand there are 435 members of House of Representatives. Probably all 435 have hospitals in the district with lots of employers. I worked at a hospital. I know the political power of having your nurses, your doctors, your patients organize and speak to elected representatives. I know the health insurance industry. It's so complicated to keep up. What the heck is a PBM? I mean, I remember 2-3 years ago, well, maybe it was a little more because it's pre-pandemic, going to Congress and trying to talk to individuals about what a PBM is. And, these staffers and the elected officials are like, what? What are you talking about? So it's very complicated. I got an easy one. But on the other side, let's just beat up on the pharmaceutical companies. So easy to do. Oh, yeah, these pharmaceutical companies. Let's beat them up, because it's so high. Look at these. Look at a number. We'll throw out a big number, even though that's not the number that patients pay. But we'll throw it out because it's easier.
I'd like to ask one final question to all our panelists. So if you could just give us, what's your most important takeaway from this panel? What do you want to leave the audience with? Would you like to start, Tiffany?
Sure. Well, for me, I just think that education is really important. Understanding this is such a complex situation. There are media going all over the place making this sound like this is the best thing for the patient. I mean, I would sign the petition if I didn't know any better, right? And so just really stay educated. And then also for those who are associated with patient organizations or affiliated groups, there is the coalition, which I mentioned, AI Arthritis is leading. And please, anyone who is a patient or caregiver, disease agnostic, affected, please encourage them to sign up to the Patient Inclusion Council. This is peer-led. We're teaching, we're educating, and then also they have opportunities not only to speak and share their stories, but to participate in reviewing the process and even joining us to meet with these PDAB and CMS. So there's lots of opportunity for that.
That's great. Stephen?
Yeah, so one of the first slides I saw today, I'm going to butcher the exact quote, but it said something like, what we do for patients. And I think that's the key. What you do in the biopharmaceutical world is for patients, and you enable us to live better lives and become contributors to society. So I thank you, and I think it's important that the patient voice is never lost as we go forward.
And I'll just note that the pace of policy change is dizzying. Particularly, I focus on the states, so I'll say particularly in the state level. I've been doing this for 20 years for different parts of the healthcare world, and I've never quite seen an environment like today at the state level. So, try to keep up with this dizzying pace, stay engaged, and really sort of voice your concerns where you have them, because, there's very important voices in this room that need to be heard. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.